Welcome into the episode of Patrick Jones Baseball. In this week's episode, we have Zach Brandon on the podcast. Zach, for the last 7 years, has been the mental skills coordinator for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Now he's predominantly working with coaches in all sports just to help them from a personal standpoint and then also professional standpoint too. And he goes into detail on that in this episode. So we talk a lot about how to help players, specifically baseball players in this episode, and what he's learned from being in the Arizona Diamondbacks organization for the previous 7 years. And then we also talk about how to go about improving the lives of coaches and how he goes about helping coaches. So if you're someone who's passionate about the mental side, mental performance, whether you're a player out there and you want to have some more tools to improve your performance, or whether you're a coach and you want to figure out how you can provide a better environment for your players to learn, this is going to be a great episode for you. So make sure you subscribe, rate, leave a review wherever you listen. And lastly, but most importantly, hope you enjoy this episode with Zach Brandon. All right, well, now welcome to the podcast, Zach Brandon. Zach, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, Patrick, I appreciate the invitation you having me, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing for those, and not just the baseball community, but coaches and leaders, parents, and all that. I've followed your work for a while here, and so it's an honor to be invited on the show.
I appreciate that, and I know we'll talk about this later on, but I know you just recently started a podcast yourself. But take me back, like kind of your background, your journey. Like you're obviously in the maybe the mental performance space. I don't know exactly what you would call it, but growing up, like were you somebody who struggled with that, and that kind of brought you to that side, or was it something else? Like growing up, like what could you ever predicted that you would do this for a living?
I've never been asked that. So I appreciate that question. That's kind of a new way to be reflective of my experience and my journey. Sports has always been very core to who I am. It's always been something I've been passionate about. I played multiple sports. Baseball was that kind of first language when it came to athletics. And so I would say, I think in retrospect, my mental game actually was fairly solid for the most part. Like I grew up, my dad taught me like to be composed, to be stoic, to manage your emotions. Like I felt like I understood that and had a foundation for that. And then when I got into college, I got kind of tested a little bit. Like I had a really good freshman year, sophomore year, kind of like the sophomore slump. And probably got a little ahead of myself where I thought I was. And then it really wasn't until my junior year that I took an intro to sports psychology class where I discovered like, oh, there's this whole profession out there where you can take learning about the mind and psychology and then blend that with athletics and coaching. And that to me was from the beginning very appealing and really drew me in. But I think the reason I bring that up that was helpful is because when I discovered that, I still had 2 years of college as a student athlete to apply a lot of the things I was learning. So it gave me this like really beautiful lab, if you will, to experiment, to try things, to learn breathing techniques, to learn about the importance of self-talk and routines and all that. And I think more than anything, it helped me refine it because I think, even now I know others that you've had on the show that talk about the mental game. It's not just for those that have a poor, mental approach. It's not just for the quote unquote weak person. It's, you don't have to be sick to get better is kind of the notion that people like to advertise. And so I think in the same vein, I think for me, it just helped me find one or two more edges in my game. And then since then it's been kind of a beautiful marriage, I guess, for not only to culminate my playing career, but then to transition into it full time as a professional.
Yeah, and it's no different than, I mean, lifting weights, right? Like, obviously, if you get strong lifting weights, you're not going to then just stop lifting weights. Like, you have to continue to do it, continue to work at it. And so it's the exact same concept with the mental game or mental performance is like, it's kind of like a muscle. It's like you don't ever get there, right? You get better and things like that, but you always have to continue to work on it. Where did you play at? Where'd you go to college?
Linfield College. It was Linfield College. Now it's Linfield University. I'm repping them right now. This
Let's
is the
go.
Wildcat. So my one of my teammates is the head coach over there, Jordan Harlow. So shout out to him. But yeah, so
Where is that at?
it's a small school in Oregon. I think we had like maybe 1,700 kids, students when I was there in school. So yeah, Division III. So we played in the Northwest Conference and was fortunate to be a part of. I think we had won 3 conference championships, one national title, and then we went to the World Series my senior year, and we went 2 in barbecue. So we were out.
So started doing some more mental game stuff after you took that sports psychology class, and after that you had 2 more years, and so when you were experimenting with routines, with breathing techniques, visualization, like whatever it is, like did you quickly realize not everything works for me personally, and so maybe that's the case for other people as well, is like, man, like maybe the first rule is there are no rules?
I think with that, like, I mean, let's just use baseball for an example. Like, you can look at pitchers and you could watch an entire team's worth of pitchers, however many that is, and you're going to see their own unique fingerprint in terms of how they do things and what makes them successful and the strengths that they bring and, how they tick and all of that. And so I say that from a standpoint of like that applies on the technical side of the game, the physical side of the game, but it does also apply on the mental side that I don't necessarily believe in just cookie cutter. Here, let me introduce you to, I'm going to introduce everybody to the same cardinal skills. Now, certainly there are some core skills that over the course of time, that there's some pretty good evidence that those are kind of skills that if you can leverage and you can hone and make your own, I do think that they can have a lot of value. But I don't like to be of the belief that it has to be done one particular way. And that's something that I'm always very quick to point out when I work with a player, when I work even with a coach, is I always say, like, I don't run a program. I don't have a cookie cutter course or anything like that. I want to cater everything to you, your unique needs, your strengths, your gifts, as well as like the context and your goals and things like that, and then help you kind of make it your own.
Yeah, I love that. Love that approach. One of the things that I think about too is you see sometimes teams where it's like everyone's doing meditation on the field or everyone's doing breathing things. And it's like it's hard because like I've been in a team environment before. And so it's kind of like I get why, you kind of sometimes may feel like you have to do it, everyone has to do it. But I was having a conversation with Dr. Brent Walker. I don't know if you know who that is or not. He's with the Dodgers. He's in the big leagues, and he's kind of similar to you, is in the mental skills department. And he told me something one time. He's like, because we were talking about breathing, and deep breaths and things like that. He's like, look, just this is where it gets complicated. And this is where not anybody can just do this stuff. He's like, and teach this. He's like, for certain people, them doing these like deep breaths and things like that actually causes anxiety. And so, like, when he told me that, I was like, whoa, like there is another level, which makes sense because of how, I mean, complicated things like the brain is and everything. And so I guess my question to you is like, when you're working with teams, how do you structure it knowing that like, hey, for some people, like this could not only like not help, but it could actually like make them worse.
A lot of my work over the last 7 years in professional baseball has been very individual geared. So yeah, we do facilitate some things at a group level, but for the most part, it tends to be very individualized. And I share that from the standpoint of, I think I love Brent, by the way, and he and I have had some great conversations over the years. And one of the things that I would add with that is I think it's really important to be clear on the outcome that you're working towards. So, for example, like the way I almost think about it is reverse engineering it. So, what happens is breath work, people fall in love with it, and you see it all over social media, and it has immense amount of value and potential. At the same time, what I want to know is like, well, what are you trying to gain from it? Like, what's the outcome or the behavior that you're trying to create or shape or influence from it? And I share that from a standpoint of there are certain players where more like traditional, like breath work, slow things down, manage, like do more like body awareness, body scans. Like there are circumstances where that is not an ideal technique or practice for that player to engage in. Now, I think more often than not, there's pretty good evidence that it does catch the majority of players, that there are a large number of players that can benefit from it. But I think to that point, there is some nuance to it. So to just copy paste and plug and play something that you see, I think that's where it is helpful, if and when possible, to have it be a little bit more individualized and driven. Like, just even take, for instance, I'll use my own career as a quick example. I very rarely talk about my career, but one of the things I learned early on was the breath work and the breathing. And one of the things that I found that helped me, like I was very much the pitcher that before a game, I would be listening to like EDM music. It would be blasting. I'd be getting my heart rate up. Like I'd be really trying to get like really activated. And then around the third, fourth inning, I was like, man, I'm already gassed. Like I was already kind of feeling it. And I think I had expended so much energy and so much fuel already before even getting into a competition that it was kind of working against me. And so, in the same vein, like, one of the things I learned was I would practice breath work between innings. I would practice some breathing beforehand. And like, again, that for me worked. And yet I also know that there are a lot of players that when you ask them when they perform their best, they feel like they perform at a higher intensity. And so to just say, hey, you should be doing meditation or more calming, down regulating kind of breath work techniques. I think you have to be a little mindful of that.
Parents, are you tired of spending money going from showcase to camp, not even knowing if a coach is even looking for your son's position or even knows his name? One of the reasons that I started my college baseball recruiting service is to help guide families throughout the recruiting process so you're not having to waste money and time going from showcase or camp to camp. If you're interested in hearing more about how I can help your son, head to patrickjonesbaseball.com and fill out the form. That's patrickjonesbaseball.com. Fill out the form right on the homepage, and I'll be in touch. All right, back to the podcast. If you could pick one thing that you've learned working in professional baseball, having worked with tons of players at all levels, what's the one thing that, like, man, when I first started, I never knew that this would be true or that this would help the most amount of players, or maybe there's an anecdote or something like that you're like, man, it does depend because of this that happened. Like, is there anything that sticks out that you're like, this is the main thing that, like, for me, I'll give you an example. Like, I was in professional baseball for 2 years. And I think for me, what the biggest thing that stuck out is, like, obviously the physical skills, anybody can see that. But it was kind of like seeing like how even like the top of the top players, like if you go behind the scenes, like they doubt themselves just as much as, a 12-year-old who walks into a cage at times. So I think for me, it's kind of like, man, like these guys, they do doubt themselves at times, just like anybody else. It's just they don't do it for as long of a period, or they just hide it better. Is there anything like that for you that sticks out?
I think that's a great example because I think one thing that you start to discover when you're around them is, to your point, what they often feel or what they often think is so normal to like what so many others, especially those that get in their own way, or especially those that feel like their confidence waxes and wanes, and they doubt themselves and all that. But the difference is like how they choose to act with it. And the difference is, I don't think what you feel doesn't have to dictate how you act. And I think that's an important separator that I think a lot of elite performers can start to create for themselves, is recognizing that I can have a thought, but it doesn't mean I have to believe it. I can have a thought or I can feel one way, but that doesn't mean I have to act on it. So again, like, let's just use the very classic waking up to go work out in the morning. Like, I don't know about others listening to this, like, it's not my favorite thing. There's a lot of mornings where I don't quote unquote feel like working out or doing something that is uncomfortable, but I know I need to do it. I think what a lot of elite performers have been able to do is create a system so that way, and develop a mindset that allows them to have that thought and feeling, but again, still choose to act in a way that is geared towards whatever their goals are, whatever their values are, and so on. So I do think, to that point, that could be it. That's a great example that I've observed. I think the one other thing that I become very bullish on is, and I think I've always kind of known this even before getting into professional baseball, but I think it's become even more apparent, is that the number one influencer of a player's performance or ability to grow and develop are the coaches. And that is why so much of my work, I think, now is geared towards going to and through them, because their relationships that they have. Let's just use even the classic. I had this conversation with a college basketball coach this morning. We kind of talked about the three very subconscious almost questions that players are reflecting on when working with a coach. It's, hey, can I trust you? Do you care about me? And can you help me? Like, in essence, that's what every player is internally processing before they work with you and before they hopefully have buy-in. But what I've found is that there are a lot of coaches that don't know exactly how to be great in those three questions, or to answer to help an athlete get clarity and alignment with those three questions. And so a lot of my work now is geared towards, like, how do I help you as a coach foster trust with your players at an accelerated level? How do I help you impact them on the field, in their inner game, in their life outside of the field? And then also, hey, how do you show that How do you demonstrate care? And what are the best ways to do that to accelerate that? Because I think now, like, let's just use college sports as an example. Like, because of the turnover, because of the transient, like the fluidity of college sports right now, like players are in and out. Like, you don't have the 4 years, 3, 4 years to now nurture and grow relationships, let alone in the recruiting cycle. Now that needs to get accelerated. And I think there's thankfully some very good frameworks and tools and things like that that can help coaches. So I say all that. I think that's something that I've had more clarity around over the years, is that I think the most impactful work is done through coaches.
Well, speaking of like, well, okay, we'll talk about through coaches. Let's say a coach comes to you and says, maybe he would never say this is something that I would say, but maybe if I come to you, Zach, and I'm like, I have a player who they really need to change their identity. Like their identity, just as a baseball player, it's so negative. Everything's negative. They think that they're only a 250 hitter, an average hitter, and it's like because quite frankly, if you don't have a good identity or a good perspective on what's going on around you, I mean, no breath work or visualization, anything is going to change that. Like that's kind of the foundation. What would you, in a scenario like that, what would you recommend? Like, what would be like maybe like the first steps or questions you would ask, or what would be kind of the walkthrough there?
One, I think I'd be really excited if that was the question. Like, I think like the fact that like you mentioned, like, hey, this is what I would ask you. Like, that's a high level, advanced question. Like, I love that that's where your mind went, is under like tapping into somebody's identity and recognizing that that's at the root of behavior change. It's really about the person's identity. And so that to me, and first and foremost, I think is an important place to start. With that though, where I want to kind of start is like aspirationally, like who does this player want to be, right? Like what are their goals? Like let's reverse engineer not only what do you want to accomplish, but who do you want to be in pursuit of that? How do you want your teammates to describe you? How do you want your coaches to describe you? How do you want your family to describe you? And so on. Like, let's get really clear about that image that you have for yourself and start to figure out like how people describe. What does that person do? How does that person talk to themselves? How does that person communicate to other people? How does that person show up in the weight room and so on? Once you have that vision of the aspiration of who they want to be with their identity, and that helps our create the foundation for their identity, the next step is like, what's the gap? Okay, what does that person do that you don't do? What does that person think that you don't think? And help them start to understand, like, and allow them through questions to give you guidance and direction on where they feel like they get in their own way. And I think that's like what a lot of really great coaches do, is it's not just, spoon feeding answers and giving instruction. It's asking high level questions that are simple, okay, but high level questions in terms of they create depth for somebody so they start to reveal their own answers. And I think that's become, I guess, a core component of my own philosophy and approach, because I've spent the last decade now like working with some really elite performers, and what I find more often than not is they know deep down, like oftentimes the answers, like deep down they know what they need. They've just drifted off course, or they need a reminder. I think coaches are professional reminders more often than not. So once you have that aspirational identity, you now can create nudges for players to get them on track and to help point out, like, hey, you said that this is who you want to be, and now I'm not seeing that from you. So it also makes the accountability easier for you as a coach, because you've allowed them to say, this is who I want to be. So that I think for me is where I would start to kind of guide a coach towards. I think one quick example I'd give that's maybe brings it to life is, I don't know how many coaches on here are familiar with like the statue of David, but there is like this like famous quote from Michelangelo where he basically talked about, and I'm going to butcher the quote a little bit here, but like he talked about like this marble, like looking and gazing into that marble and then chiseling away everything that wasn't David. I think that's oftentimes what we're doing as coaches, is we're saying, hey, you're this blank piece of marble. You tell us who you want to be. What's that beautiful statue underneath, or that identity that you want to become? Now let's help you chisel away the habits, the stories, the self-talk, the whatever that's getting in the way of that. And I think that to me is kind of where that process starts.
Yeah, very well done by you. Very well explained. I really liked those examples. when you say, if you're asking to me is like, okay, where do you want to go? What do you want to be? Is there, because there's certain things that maybe you could say are like outcome where it's like, okay, I want to be a major league all-star. And it's like, great, that's awesome. Should that be the focus, or should my focus be on like the process that's going to allow me to become that major league all-star? And like that's the vision, that's the North Star, is that process. And by focusing on that, I'll eventually get to, the ultimate goal.
This is where one of the beautiful things about our mind, and it can also be one of the challenges with our mind, is it can time travel. So I bring that up because like when you do that exercise with a player and you create this aspirational version of them and help them understand like who their ideal self and performer is, you're allowing them to go to the future. And that's important. Like that's useful. I bring that up because, and I've been guilty of this honestly on my own. So I'm not throwing shade to anybody that does this, but we've become so, I think, conditioned to say, like, be where your feet are, like, be in the moment, like, focus on the present. Like, yes, when it comes to performance, like, in the moment, being present and having your attention to what's in front of you is essential. Like, that is, there's a quote that attention is the currency of performance. Like, that is where the money is made. High performance is your attention. That being said, though, I do think there are moments where time travel is really useful. So I bring that up from the standpoint of think there are, let's use that once you've defined that future self, asking yourself, okay, well, what would that person do right now? How would that person attack this workout today? How would this person, what would this person want to get out of or their goal for this bullpen session or this cage session? Like starting to think about that's where you start to funnel it down to a process. But again, it's rooted in the identity that you've said, because I think like I'll use the example too, where we always used to tell the guys that came into the new draft class, like the day you become a big leaguer is not the day that you get called up to the show. Like that's not the day you become a big leaguer. That has to have been a choice, a decision, an identity that you've created before then. It happens in the minor leagues, and maybe it happens in college. It happens early on. And then what that does is it guides your actions and your thoughts. So that way, when that day comes, it's like you've already cultivated that over the course of time. So I bring that up is because I do think, yes, it is about process and funneling your focus to today and what is it going to help. If that's what you want to achieve, what can I do right now to create that or to live into that? At the same time, the last caveat I would add, though, is there are inevitably moments in a journey where you reach a plateau as a player or you deal with a setback or adversity or something like that. I do think that is also sometimes a window where it's important to zoom out and go to the future and remind yourself of who you want to be.
Mm.
Because I think that's ultimately, again, going to be a driver for you, in theory, pushing you towards whatever goals that you've set for yourself. So, all that to say, your mind can time travel, which is good and bad, and I think you can leverage it in all directions. And I think that's helping players understand when is the right time and place for all of that is important.
I think you brought up a great point there, because it's like, even with the journey, right? It's like, well, if it's all about the journey, which I mean, I get that for sure, but it's like, so I'm supposed to just stay in the minor leagues forever? Like, this is the journey. Like, at some point, you do want to get to where you want to go. So I think yeah, that was really well said by you. One of the ways that, or one of the things that I believe anyway, speaking more so from like a hitting standpoint anyway, is like, or even pitcher, like whatever in life in general, is to be present. It's kind of piggyback on what we talk about, is like, is to be able to be present in the moment, be able to focus. And so it's of my opinion where it's sure unicorns, of course, like the Shohei Otanis and the best, there's some players who they really can just turn it on, turn it off. It doesn't matter what's going on outside of in their personal life or whatever. But I think for the majority, I think the off the field and on the field are intertwined, because I think if you don't close some of those open loops, then they linger on in your mind and it becomes harder to focus during the game. Like, I'll give you an example. I think if players got the best grades they possibly can, like when they showed up to the park, it would allow them to be more present because they don't have an open loop and they're not worrying about what just happened and their grades and all these other things that they're not taking care of business on. And then I think another thing too is, from the focus standpoint, is like, All right, how do you train that on a day by day basis? And so, one of the things I'm curious to hear what you think about this. One of the things that I've told players before is when you feel the urge to check your phone, because let's be honest, most of the time you're not checking your phone for like work, especially as a player, anything really important. When you feel the urge to check your phone because you're just bored, if you can resist that urge, what you're doing is you're training your mind, be like, no, 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 like we're gonna focus on what we want to focus on, not what you want to focus on. So you're basically training yourself to be able to focus. So if you're in a grocery store and you're in line and you're just bored. Like what I always say is like the hardest thing to do is nothing. If you can resist that urge, you're training yourself to be able to focus. So when you do want to be able to focus, you can turn it on, turn it off. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think there's I'll give an example, and I think this applies to multiple things. This applies to not just where we direct our focus, but to our thoughts, to our actions and stuff is like I always tell players, I'll use thoughts for a quick moment. Like I always say, I care more about your second thought than your first thought. And what I mean by that is the first thought is that initial gut reaction, right? That's hey, the ping of the phone or somebody says something to you, they slight you in a certain way, or somebody cuts you off in traffic or whatever. What I'm most interested in is what you choose to do next. And that to me is a response. Now, I think it obviously gets easier if you can create some space between that. Right. And that's where, again, like something like a breath work or something like some meditation and things like that can be one mechanism or practice to help with that. But I do think that that's something that a lot of good performers are able to cultivate is a difference between that impulsive reaction versus an intentional response. And I think the better you get at that, the more just deliberate you are. Like, I mean, people love to ask, like, hey, like you've spent all these years in professional baseball, like, what do the best in the world do that others don't? And I'm like, well, I think one is there's an intentionality that they bring to what they do on a day to day basis that's very unique in terms of I think I've seen it in multiple ways, not necessarily like somebody that does every single one of these. There are some exceptions, but like you see intentionality in how a guy prepares physically. You see intentionality in how a guy carries himself off the field, like you mentioned. Like there's a player that I know who I mean, it was amazing. Like he, in the last how many years, has gotten really into sleep and recognizing the importance of sleep. He literally bought or like rented an apartment downtown near our stadium. So that way, when we got in from a long road trip, he didn't have to drive all the way to his home. He could just walk across the street, like get some sleep and save himself at least an hour, if you will. And I'm like, man, that's a different level of intentionality. Now, I know not everybody listening to this can be like, oh, let me have a second home where I like, like I'm mindful of that. But I bring that up of like, there are those performers that are so intentional about not just how they show up in those hours at the field, but also those hours away from the field. And again, I think that's again where you start to see some people separate themselves.
So would you say then self awareness is the most important thing?
I do think self-awareness is always a really great starting point. Like, because I want to know how somebody thinks about themselves. I want to know how they talk to themselves. I want to know what they think their strengths and gifts are. That's something that I'm very deliberate with is like, we love to default to people's areas of weakness or what needs to improve in somebody's game. And the reality is like, I also want to know what you're really good at because I want you to be able to double down because I know, like, I've listened to meetings where a coach will ask a pitcher, for example, hey, bottom of the ninth inning, game on the line. Scouting report says this is your weapon, which is a different pitch. Like, which one you going to? And they're like, I'm going to my best pitch. Like,
Mhm.
I'm going to what can trust and not just what the scouting report says. Like, 95% of players have responded that particular way. So I want to know that. I'll give a quick example, maybe too, of how I think about this because I think this is relevant for coaches. One of my favorite frameworks that I've used with players and staff is something I differentiate as the gap versus the gain. Are you familiar with this at all?
Mm-mm.
So take for instance, like let's go back to like opening day, and imagine you're a player opening day, and then as the season progresses, you at opening day had an ideal image of how that season was going to go. Maybe your goals, your expectations for yourself, maybe expectations other people had. And then as the season progresses, you start to move towards that ideal that you created for yourself. Now, for some, if you're having a great season, you might be really close. Others, you may feel like you're really far away and the season has been nothing close to what you hope to achieve. What I find is one manner in which a lot of players will sabotage themselves is they become very fixated on the gap between where they're at currently and the ideal that they set for themselves. That gap is a really tricky one because when you show up and you train and you practice, like, yeah, you're going to work on the gap. Like, you're going to try to build your competence. Like, you need to hone your skills. That's one of the best ways to build confidence is through improving your craft. So you're going to work on the gap. But at the same time, where I find players get into trouble is when they live there and their mind is constantly comparing themselves to an ideal that they're one probably not going to oftentimes achieve, and it just feeds this narrative of like you're not good enough. So what I also try to invite players and coaches to think about is like, how can you also acknowledge somebody's gains? Because there's been players that I've worked with who the box score said one thing in June that they weren't thrilled about, like their stats weren't great, but if I asked them, are you a better player today than you were on opening day? Like they'd say, yeah, like I've gotten better in X, Y, Z. That to me are some of your gains. So I think part of our job as coaches is to help players not only work on their gaps, but it's to also help shine a light on their gains too. And I think those can also then show up in those strengths as well.
What do you think is overrated when it comes to maybe it's, if you're working with coaches and you see, hey, like across the board, like, if you're trying to build a culture, or you're trying to work with a player, or the coach trying to work with a player, like, is there something that's overrated? For me, like, I'll give you another example to kind of maybe like help you ideate here is I think people, hopefully nobody screen grabs this and like, rolls on me on Twitter. From a hitting standpoint, I think hitting mechanics are extremely overrated. I do. I really
Okay.
just I never come across very many former players who are like, you know what? I would have been so much of a better hitter had only my hitting mechanics been better, right? It's like every time it's like I couldn't get out of my own head. I couldn't stick with my approach. It's just dealing with failure in general. So I think from a hitting standpoint, hitting mechanics are overrated. Is there anything in your field based on the coaches you've worked with, the players, like whatever it is across any sport? Is there anything that you see, whether it's breath work, visualization, anything that you think you personally, and maybe it's a contrarian take, but you think is overrated?
I don't know if my initial reaction to that, maybe it's because of the example you gave, is I wanted to say like the A swing. Like I can't stand when I listen to players say, I'm just trying to get my A swing off because I'm just like, how often do you have that in a game? And it's like,
Right.
yet they spend such a disproportionate amount of time trying to hone this perfect swing or this A swing in training when it's like really like what I want is an adaptable swing. Like I want you to be able to have, we have a hitting coach who talks about having multiple clubs in your bag. Like I want you to be able to hit a line drive, or if you're a righty, hit a opposite field line drive in the gap. I also want you to be able to, hit the ball off of the batter's eye in center field, in the air. Like there's, you got to have, I think, some range to that. So I think that would be one that initially comes to mind that I'm just like, and I think as coaches, sometimes it's a good intention. I think it's a good intention that has unintended consequences is how much time we spend on the technical side. And I get it because we have video, we have amazing tools, we can see it with our eye. Like you can immediately watch somebody take one swing to a next swing and see a difference. So it's easier to coach. It's a lot harder to coach the human being. And more often than not, when I have surveyed a coach and I've asked them, hey, if a player isn't performing to their potential or they're having a down season, I've never heard them say it's because they didn't have a good A swing. I've never heard them say it's, like it's now mechanics. Do they matter? Absolutely. Like, is it like, do I know players that have like dug themselves in holes and struggles and things because their mechanics did have number of different flaws in them? Yeah. But I do think it gets overemphasized. And I think again, that's where just being really intentional about how you design training, how you ask questions, when you give information and when you are okay with silence too, and allowing players again to self-organize, to discover on their own, and all those different things that start to tap into this physical skill acquisition world. So again, I'm probably a little skewed because of what you gave as an example, but like that's definitely one where I'm like, it drove me nuts.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to mechanics, your mind affects mechanics more than anything else. Like, even if your mechanics are off or you see a player's mechanics start to become off, it doesn't mean that you need to focus on mechanics or you need to do specific drills or anything like that. And I'll give you an example is like you could be in the box and let's just say hypothetically, like your front shoulder's flying open. Well, it's like maybe you're anxious, maybe you're doubting yourself, and that's just a sign of you trying to get out of the way early. So it's like, yeah, I could see my front, maybe on video, you could see your front side's pulling out, but you don't, but the why has nothing to do with mechanics or movement. It's because of, your mind that, you're anxious or whatever it is. So that's why there's a lot of variables that do go into this. I know you work with other sports and I know you work, Zach, with coaches and other sports. Talk to me about what exactly you're doing now and how you're working with coaches. And then maybe like, what are some of is there anything you've learned now having worked in other sports and kind of from a different side of things now that maybe has made you better at your craft?
One, I'll say this. I mean, this conversation's pretty fresh from a kind of a transition from me. I spent the last 7 years in professional baseball and most recently head of mental performance and coach development. And what I found, I think the pivot for me has kind of been driven by two things. One is I have two young kids, and I basically didn't want to miss them growing up and spend all this time on the road. So for me, that's been the biggest driver of stepping away and pivoting to this kind of my own business now. That being said, the other reason is because coaching to me is one of those very few professions where you pour so much into everyone else, and yet who pours into you?
Mm,
That for me for years has just not sat well, and I've kind of now shifted my own personal calling and mission to being a thought partner, a coach for coaches, and wanting to better serve them and really understand their challenges, their pain points, the things that are keeping them not just externally, but from within. Like again, much like players, like I know plenty of leaders. I've done it myself where sometimes you get in your own way. And I think yet coaches, for whatever reason, there is no playbook for how to really become a better coach. Like, yes, there's courses. Yes, there's conferences. Yes, there's all sorts of great virtual material. But again, it kind of goes back to our conversation about players is like, I do think there's an individualized kind of component to it as well. And so for me, that's become a shift where, coaches have, we like to joke, like coaches have all these game plans, for, scouting reports and everything for all this other stuff, yet they don't have a game plan for their career.
mm,
And that for me is something that I've now become really passionate about is being a space for them to, I think twofold. One is become the leader that they aspire to be. Like, let's go back to like the Michelangelo thing and like, okay, you tell me, who do you want to be as a coach, as a leader? Let's craft a vision for what that looks like. Let's understand what's getting in the way of that. And then let's help you cultivate a new system, a different mindset, some tools and frameworks to get you there. So that's on one hand, but then the other side of it is helping coaches foster an environment where they bring out the best in their people. And that to me is where like I love having conversations with coaches about things like culture, things like, creating learning environments, things like how do you foster and strengthen connection, and then even systems too. Like I'll give a quick example. There was a clip I shared recently of Sean McVay. No, I'm sorry. I take that back. Different clip. A video I shared recently of James Franklin. He just accepted the job at Virginia Tech to be their new head football coach. And one of the things he talked about is how important it was for him to create a high quality learning and teaching environment. And he said that is a competitive advantage for us. So he would bring in experts in teaching and pedagogy and things like that to help their staff become better educators, to better teachers. One of the things that they did that I loved was, and I've heard this from some others, like they would literally film their presentations, their coaching sessions. And I thought, what a wonderful way to get feedback and to hone your craft. So things like that, it's like, what's your system for how you're growing yourself, your staff, and so on. So all that to say, sorry, that's part one, I guess, of your question. I think the part two is around the fact of drawing from other arenas. Correct me if I'm wrong. I just have always really enjoyed studying like human excellence and not being restricted to just baseball, not just being restricted to sport. I really love studying like the people that are the best in the world at what they do in any given craft. I think there's so much you can learn. And I think there's a lot of great examples. I'll share one really just quick one that I come across recently. And I'm sharing this because it's also, I find like even with my podcast now, it's like I share a lot of these as reminders to myself. But there was a great story about Warren Buffett. And basically, he had one of his private pilots who felt like he wasn't quite reaching his potential. He had some different goals and dreams that he had set for himself. And yet he felt like he was falling up short. So he asked Warren Buffett one day for advice. And he said, all right, like write down your top 20, 25 priorities, all the things that you're trying to accomplish. He was like, then I want you to narrow it down to what are the main five or what are the main 3 to 5 that you feel like make the biggest difference for you. And then he was like, and then and then go all in on those, like just lock in on that. Because I think what happens, I see this with coaches, even myself, is where it's like there's always something new getting added to your plate. It's easy to keep chasing things and then just reacting your way through the day versus like now what I love helping coaches do is like, all right, within today or within this week or within this month, like you tell me what's the most important things you want to allocate your time and energy to. Boom. Okay, let's identify those. What does that look like? When show me your calendar. When are you working on these things? Like, let's make it so that way again you can move towards your closest self. So again, that's kind of a non-sport example, but like I love finding stories like that in parallel arenas that I think can teach us lessons in leadership, mindset, and so on.
Great example. Great example. I love that. Big fan of Warren Buffett too. Zach,
Yeah.
where can someone go if they want to, if a coach is listening to this, wants to work with you, should they go to your podcast? Like, where should they go to get more information from you?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways. I mean, I think anybody that's interested in hearing kind of more, I do talk about some of these things in the podcast. It's called the Threshold Lab. So you can find that on pretty much all the major podcast platforms. I do show interviews on YouTube. So basically, it's during the week, I share these bite-sized 4 to 8 minute clips and stories, things like the Warren Buffett one, little stories, analogies that coaches can maybe use as, present with presentations to their teams or sharing principles with a player or whatever the case might be. And then on the weekend, I usually try to release an interview with a coach across the different sport. And we unpack things like the inner game of leadership, building culture, mindset, coaches development, and so on. So that's kind of what the podcast is about. I do have a newsletter, an email newsletter. It's called Winning with Words. You can find that. You can send the link out to anybody interested, but I have it listed on my I have a Twitter profile or X or whatever we call it nowadays, and then LinkedIn. So you can find my email newsletter there. Basically, it's kind of similar in a way to the podcast, but it's basically just I share a story, I share why it matters to performers, and then I share a practical way that a coach or leader could teach it or introduce it to their players or to those that they serve. So I think those are the three biggest areas: the newsletter, podcast, those two social media accounts. Those are the main ones I'm on. But yeah, those are probably the best ways to get in touch.
Awesome, Zach. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.